A curious quirk of psychological research during the 1940s and 50s was this idea that children, specifically children around the age of 10 or 11, were ideal research subjects. For one thing, they were considered to be easier to deceive, so it was thought that their reactions to external stimuli would be more raw and spontaneous and honest. And they were old enough to have some social skills, but not so old that teenage rebelliousness had set in. We now know that this was, well, wrong. A developing mind doesn't react to stimuli in the same way that a fully developed mind does, and children, being dependent on their parents and still learning how to navigate their way through the world, are actually quite vulnerable to social group expectations and cultural influences. So their reactions aren't quite as raw and spontaneous and honest as was once believed. And as for children being easier to deceive, we're going to get to that. This brings us to another quirk of psychological research from the 1940s and 1950s, the idea that summer camps were the ideal research environment. According to author Gina Perry, researchers yearned for easy access to child subjects free from contaminants, by which they meant parents and school and church and all that nasty stuff. Summer camps were literally just what the doctor ordered. As pioneering child psychologist Mary Northway wrote in 1940, the summer camp offers an ideal field for research for the social psychologist. It is an isolated, constant, temporary group, as far removed from the ordinary roads of social intercourse as a South Sea island. While camp lasts, it is an isolated community, and may be considered a society in miniature. That might sound a bit sinister and clinical, but summer camps have always been something of an experiment. The first summer camps in America were organized during the 1860s by schoolmasters who were worried that industrialization was harming the character of America's young men. Later, educator Ernst Balk founded a summer camp with the express purpose of keeping young men from spending too much time with their mothers during the summer and becoming feminized. Men never change. But things got really weird in the late 1940s with the advent of the Cold War. Paranoia about Soviet psychological warfare and propaganda was everywhere, and Western governments, particularly America, decided that the best way to fight back was with propaganda and psychological warfare of their own. Programs like the Yale University Communication and Attitude Change Program were started, and the grant money was flowing freely. One recipient of that grant money was Muzaffar Sherif, who, armed with a $35,000 grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, that's over $430,000 in today's money, was about to set out to prove that he could demonstrate what makes friends turn on each other and go to war, and what it takes to bring them together again.